Hello everyone, welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video I want to begin talking about training data. And so if you remember back to our previous video when we talked about the sort of generic concept of supervised classification, we said that training data was the way that we interacted with the model. And so what you can think of training data as you can think of it as a way for the user to pass in known locations. So the model puts in quotes knows what each class should look like. So maybe a good example of this would be if you were trying to do a classification of the campus, right? You might think, okay, well, I'd want a class that would be, pavement. I might want a class that would be grass, and I might want a class that would be, ponds or lakes. And so what you might do is you might take a GPS unit like your cell phone, and you might walk around outside and stand on the sidewalk and get a GPS point. Then you might walk over, stand on the grass, take a GPS point. Right, and assuming that you're reasonably accurate with your GPS on your cell phone and that you take reasonably good notes, right, you could feed that information into the classification algorithm and say, hey, I know that this location in the image where this GPS point is a sidewalk. I know that this location where the GPS point is would be water. I know this location where this GPS point is grass, right? And then the algorithm would take those values that are underneath those points and say, okay, I'm going to use this information to train the model so that all the rest of the image that I don't know what they are, right, you haven't told me, I can use those points to, again, do those comparisons that we talked about in the last video. And so what I want to do in this video, and probably the next few videos, is I want to talk more about training data, how we can get it, and more importantly, the sort of thought that has to go in when you're generating training data. Okay? And so the first thing I want to do is how do we get training data? Right, well, there's really two sources. The first is the internet. Right, you go online, you spend some time Googling, and you find databases that have location information for the classes that you're interested in. This is really extremely popular for things like invasive species, where you have entire networks of scientists and citizen scientists and just citizens that have gone out and with a cell phone or a GPS and said, hey, I found this invasive species here. Right, so that's one way you can get it. The other way you can get it is DIY, right? Do it yourself. Okay? And if you go the do it yourself route, there's really two ways you can do it. Right? You can GPS, which is kind of what I was talking about before, where you take your cell phone out, or maybe you spend a little bit of money to get a better GPS unit. And you literally walk out in the field where your image is going to be, and you stand there and you take a point and you look down and you say, what type of feature is this, right? Assuming that you have, you know what you're trying to map. And again, going back to that idea of campus, right, you might say, well, I want to map, grass, water, and pavement and buildings. So you would stand in the middle of a parking lot, take a GPS point, and again, take notes to say, hey, this point corresponds to pavement. That's one way. The other way this is becoming increasingly popular, especially as we get higher and higher spatial resolution imagery, is actually digitization. Right, and this would be where, similar to when we created those spectral profiles, if you remember back to a few labs ago, right, where we actually load the image up in something like ArcGIS Pro, and we actually click on the image and say, hey, this point in the image corresponds to grass, or corresponds to pavement, or corresponds to soil, or whatever classes you're looking at. The key thing with digitization, though, is you have to remember your elements of interpretation, right? Right, you have to make sure that when you're digitizing, right, you're confident that what you're picking out is what it actually is. So you'd have to, generate those elements of, color, size, shape, etc. So that way you're confident that if you put a point down and you say it's forest, that it's actually forest, because you aren't, you're not going out there and actually looking at the real world. So what I want to do in the next video is, in the next video, I want to talk about something called the training data criteria. And we're going to go through, again, a list of of things you have to be aware of when you're collecting training data, assuming that you're doing it the DIY approach. So hopefully this makes sense. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.